Hello and welcome to the Royal United Services Institute and to our weekly look at how the pandemic is affecting international relations and security relations. Today we look at the question of the contact tracing apps. These particular instruments, technological instruments, which are meant to provide us with the ability to contain the pandemic, to contain it, that is, until we find either a vaccine or an effective cure. The ability to identify clusters of infections or indeed individuals who may have been infected and therefore provide the owners of the app with an informed choice about where they move and allegedly how many risks they are prepared to take while moving among their normal business. We're joined by a team of legal experts who have looked at it from every angle, from the question of the legality of the apps, of the data that they collect, of the way the data is processed, and of course, on the question of reliability and credibility, one of the key concerns in this entire story, since it is accepted by all the governments which are promoting these apps that ultimately the question will be one of the percentage of uptake. If they do not have a large uptake, then even if they are accurate and even if they meet all the stringent data safety criteria, they will not still be very useful. And the uptake cannot, of course, be decreed by fiat. We're joined, therefore, by three very great experts on the topic who have looked at it from a variety of perspectives. Marion Oswald, who is a senior fellow of law at the University of Northumbria and is also an associate fellow at RUSI. Carly Kind, who directs the Ada Lovelace Institute and who's an expert on technology policy and digital rights. And finally, Carol McCartney, a professor at the School of Law at Northumbria University, the same university of Marion's. Marion, let's start with you. Your microphone, Marion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan, for that introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be on this webinar and to be speaking also with Carly and Carol. What I would like to do initially is to run through where, a brief overview really of where we are with the contact tracing app in England, and I suppose I should emphasize that I'm talking mainly about the app that's been proposed by the NHS for England. Obviously other apps in other jurisdictions are available. I'm sure we'll touch on those as well during the discussion. So to talk firstly about the NHS app and how it works. We have a lot of information that's been provided by NHSX about their proposals for their app that's currently on trial in the Isle of Wight, and I think we're expecting the results of that trial to be published quite soon. I thought it'd be useful just to go through the basics around the operation of the app. Using basically the NHS's own words around the functionality. So as they've described, once you install your app on the phone, it can detect using the Bluetooth functionality if other phones are also running the app, are in the vicinity. And the NHS described this as knowing how close your phone has been to other phones running the app and for how long. And this allows the app to build up an idea of your contacts, and if you then develop symptoms, allows the app to notify other phone owners that they are at risk. So it's dependent on you then reporting that you've experienced coronavirus symptoms, uploading that to the app, and then the system will alert all other phones that have been nearby, and advice given to the owners of that phone to self-isolate. What the NHS information states that if the diagnosis is subsequently seen to be wrong, then other users are supposed to get another alert letting them know that they can stop self-isolating. So that's the idea behind the NHS app, and it uses an approach that's been described, and there's been lots of debate around this, as a centralized database approach. So when you download the app, you're asked to enter the first part of your postcode and Bluetooth identifiers that are used, as I said before, to deal with the interaction with other phones. Those are collected on the phone itself. However, if you report symptoms, the device identifiers and the information about how long they were communicating and the signal strength, all that information is actually passed to the NHS, and they will be held in a central database. So it's the NHS that notifies the user and other device users if they need to self-isolate. There's been a number of privacy concerns expressed around centralized solutions, particularly around what's been described as the social graph, the graph of contacts and other users that the phone has been in contact with, built up by the app's operation, and the concerns around the collection of that data by state bodies. These concerns really focus around the issues and concerns around intrusive surveillance, mission creep. So what other purposes could that data be used for, and the risk of de-anonymization. And that's why proponents of what's known as decentralized solutions, particularly an academic consortium called DP3T, argue that it's more privacy preserving to retain contact information on the device so that there is no centralized database of those types of encounters. The UK authorities, in contrast, they argue that a more centralized approach can help with the risk modeling and the actual medical public health purposes around these apps. So that's one of the key reasons for the arguments for a centralized approach. Concerns, however, about these apps are wider than privacy, and the Ada Lovelace Institute was probably the first institute within the UK to look at all the issues in detail, and I won't talk about the rapid evidence review in much detail because Carly will expand much more on that. But I picked out some key points from Ada's rapid evidence review. And I think one of the really important ones is that smartphones, as they identify in that review, are proxies for people. They don't represent the actual circumstances of individuals. The risk scoring and whether or not to notify somebody to isolate is done by an algorithm. And therefore, the technical limitations around key aspects, in particular Bluetooth, potentially make apps a poor substitute for manual contact tracing. Just on the BBC today, there was a report around the issues over using Bluetooth as a proxy for distance, and how all sorts of things like keeping your phone in a handbag where you might be walking in front of somebody or behind somebody might have an impact on the accuracy of the measurements. Further to that, a number of commentators have made the point that we can't just look at the privacy aspects in a narrow sense of where data is flowing and who has control over particular data. It's much wider than that. Something bad might happen in respect of use of these apps in a wider, more societal sense. Lillian Edwards has headed up a team of individuals who have drafted the Coronavirus Safeguards Bill 2020, which again has had a lot of interest. And the key aspect around that was to suggest a principle of non-compulsion. So make sure that nobody can be required or discriminated against as a result of not being willing to use the app or not being able to use the app. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights has also commented extensively around the issues regarding the use or non-use of an app. In their view, the current patchwork of protections, particularly around data protection, is not adequate to protect privacy. And they highlight that the DPA does not require any particular purpose. So there is a risk that data collected by the app could be repurposed for all sorts of reasons. The app, in terms of oversight, the app has got an ethics advisory board associated with it. And that board has issued some correspondence about their initial concerns to do with the app. As far as I'm aware, there's been nothing published since then. And personally, I've got a number of concerns about the remit of that advisory board and its terms of reference and its real ability to deal with some of the major issues coming out of the discussions. And I think that's particularly the case as we've had messages from the government around individuals doing their duty by downloading the app. And more recently, some suggestion, although I'm quite sure how accurate that is, about whether it might be linked to opening up beer gardens, which might encourage quite a number of people to download the app. I wrote a piece for RUSI right at the beginning of May, and I went back to it in preparation for this session and thought, has anything changed that would mean I would revisit my comments on that commentary? And actually, I don't think anything has changed as yet. I was trying to think about whether we have yet achieved a trustworthy coronavirus contact tracing app. Is the system itself trustworthy? You know, the people involved in it, can it be relied to do what it's supposed to do, doing nothing it should not do? And I don't think we're there yet. We're not really sure what is it supposed to do in the wider sense and the fit with the integrated strategy. It still seems to be reliant on self-reporting rather than a wide system of testing, and this reliance on potentially inaccurate measurements means that you've got a binary decision that hides the uncertain nature of the app's output. The way that the NHS describes the app is that it knows something about the individual, it knows the risk. In fact, the app does not know. It's making an estimation of that risk based on the key metrics within the algorithm, the proximity estimated by Bluetooth, the length of time that the phone is detecting other phones, and an analysis of how infectious the person was judged to be, depending on when they report their symptoms. So just finally, my work with RUSI on algorithms and data analytics in policing recommended that we shouldn't really call statistical forecasting systems or data analytics systems as risk assessment tools, because they don't really do that. The human user should maintain that ultimate responsibility for the risk assessment. And I think this is an aspect that needs further thought in respect of these contact tracing apps, they produce a binary output, but not yet potentially enough explanation of how that output has been generated to allow individuals to understand what they're being told and the uncertainties involved with it. So I think that's all I'd like to say at this point, and back to Jonathan now.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and I'd be grateful if you can restore exactly the screen. I should say that we have, for all taking part, that there is a question and answers option at the bottom of this Zoom app. Please do use it. Please do get the questions coming in. I think we've already got 3, but you can keep them flowing in as our panelists speak. Now, we've heard about the Ada Lovelace Institute and its pioneering work on its subject already from Marianne. Now to the person herself, to Carly Kind.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you for having me. Thanks also to Marianne for introducing some of that work. And I think that really well laid the framework for the conversation we're going to have. I'll speak a little briefly about the rapid evidence review that we did, and then I want to pick up on the question of public trust and unpack that a little. So we published the rapid evidence review back almost 2 months ago now, a week after the government first announced that it was developing an app. It was based on the expertise of more than 20 academics that we convened for a conversation about what we knew and understood about different technologies being used in the transition out of the crisis, and some of the technical considerations and the societal implications that they raise. And the review essentially explores some of those issues. So looks at the possibilities and the limitations of the technology itself, and then what the implications are for society, and what the questions raised for policymakers and for technology designers are. I should say the Ada Lovelace Institute, for those of you who don't know us, is a research institute and deliberative body, and we have a remit to ensure that data and AI work for people in society. And that means that we're really interested in understanding what the ethical and social questions raised by new technologies are. And we also come from a viewpoint which says that technology should be used where possible to make people's lives better. But in order for them to be effective, they need to be rolled out in a way that's consistent with public expectation and deserving of public trust. And so the rapid evidence review was an attempt to constructively contribute to a conversation about how technology could be used in what is essentially the largest crisis that this country faces in recent memory. What we found was that the limitations of the technology, some of which Marianne alluded to, paired with the very real challenges of needing large, widespread uptake of the tech in order to be useful, meant that there wasn't sufficient evidence to support a large reliance on contact tracing apps at the time of the report. And I would argue that that evidence probably still hasn't emerged sufficient to say that a contact tracing app can be a central and effective measure in an appropriate pandemic response or a transition out of this crisis. I think in the ensuing months, we've seen numerous changes being made to what's proposed. We've also seen a trial on the Isle of Wight, which has revealed some limitations of the technology, and we've seen some pivoting from government and NHS, as we would expect to see as a new technology is deployed and rolled out, about how that tech would be deployed. I might just speak to some of the limitations I think that still stand, just as because it might be able to inform our conversation. I think there is still a question mark about the technical accuracy of contact tracing technologies. So the technical accuracy of Bluetooth detecting proximity between two Bluetooth devices. There is still a question around how self-reported data going into a contact tracing app might work in terms of data quality and how it should inform decision making. There is still a question about whether the testing capacity exists to properly support a contact tracing system. So if, for example, 10,000 contacts are being generated every day through a contact tracing system, assuming widespread use of the contact tracing app, do we have the testing capacity to make sure all of those people are able to get tested within a reasonable period of time, such that we don't effectively return to a large-scale lockdown? And then there's a range of behavioural questions that are very much unanswered, which is, how will people react to getting messages on their phone about needing to self-isolate? Will they continue to use an app if they receive too many notifications of contacts, or will they simply turn the app off? And this relates also to the testing capacity question. And then there are a range of questions about those who don't use smartphones and how we should deal with those people who are digitally excluded. It is the case that people from deprived areas, people from BAME backgrounds, the elderly, are all more likely to become infected with and die from this virus. And yet they are the same people who are less likely to have access to smartphones. And I think there remain some unanswered questions about how the system accounts for them. And then, of course, there is the important kind of elephant in the room, which is around the uptake of the app having an impact on its effectiveness. So those of you who followed this may have seen the number 60% be bandied around, 60% being the estimate by the modelling group in Oxford of the percentage of the population who would be required to use the app in order for it to be effective in suppressing the virus. So 60% of the population is 80% of smartphone users. There has been some public attitudes research which shows that between 60 and 75%, depending on which survey you read, of people said they would be willing to download the app. But in practice, we know from other countries that the number of people who are likely to download the app is more accurately around 20%, 20 to 25% has been other countries' experiences. So there is a big question mark then about if an app and all of the kind of energy and effort and resource that has gone into building that and will continue to go into building it will only ever reach 20, 25% of the population. How will that impact the effectiveness, both technically and clinically of the app in achieving its aim? So those are all kind of unanswered questions. Just to briefly speak to the question of public trust. So I think one of the questions very closely tied up in the question of how many people will actually download this app is to what extent is it trustworthy? And one mechanism through which uptake can be increased would be to get a range of prominent people, organizations, institutions imploring people to download the app. But in order for that to be effective, I think it would be critical that the app is deserving of public trust. And in that respect, things like the privacy protections are very kind of critically tied up in public trust. And I say that off the back of public attitudes research that's been done by others, but also by the Ada Lovelace Institute. We've just finished a 4-week online public deliberation exercise with 30 members of the public, where we explored a range of questions with them. And we found some very key messages from the public that we engaged with in terms of the evidence base that they would want to see exist in order for them to trust the technology. And that includes proof that the apps are effective, lessons learned from the Isle of Wight trial, what happened and what worked and what didn't work, what have other countries' experiences been, what level of risk does the virus pose to society, that being, of course, the million-dollar question for everybody at the moment, but that is something that the public ties up in their consideration of whether or not to trust and use an app. How will the data be used by wider government? And there's a big question here because around 85% of respondents to another survey said that they had a lot of confidence in the NHS, whereas only a third of people said they had confidence in the government more broadly. So there is a preference for the NHS as the main processor of this information, but there is a question then about what other government departments would have access to that data that feeds into people's assessment of trustworthiness. And then evidence base about security of their data, etc. So those are some of the issues that have been raised in terms of what the public considers it would need to be satisfied of in order to invest their trust in such an app. I'll stop there because I realise I've gone on too long, but I can come back to some other things in questions and answers.
Carly, thank you, and thank you for laying out all the questions that are engaged in this particular debate. Unsurprisingly, some of the members of the audience have started asking precisely those questions, so I hope we'll be able to unpack it as we move to the questions and answer session. And now over to you, Carol, for the final presentation.
Many thanks, Jonathan. And again, I'd like to send my thanks for inviting me to join into this conversation. I guess what I'm interested in sharing is perhaps looking at, let me just get this presentation up here. Some of the work I've done previously has looked at integrity in terms of forensic science in particular and technologies being used in the criminal justice system. So what I was just thinking about in terms of this app in particular is how that framework around integrity that I've used before with respect to things like the DNA database in particular, but also now automated facial recognition. Is there a way we can just use this matrix to have a look at this app? And so what I'll just do quickly in these few minutes is talk about lessons that we've already learned from the mass surveillance or data collection from citizens, have a look at some of the legal principles that lie behind this, bearing in mind, of course, that when we talk about something being legal, it doesn't mean that it's also legitimate. And just finish up with some of the questions that have been raised around developments in these areas, I think are very pertinent questions that we can just apply to this app. So when I talk about integrity, this is really the matrix that I use. So I'm talking about viability, legitimacy, and acceptability. And it covers all of these things that Marion and Carly have already been talking about. So viability is really around those issues of, is it effective? Does it actually work? So is it reliable? What standards have we got for it to adhere to? Is it universal in as much as everybody can understand the results? How does it work technically and so forth? So those questions have to be asked. Legitimacy then, legality, is it lawful? But then things about human rights, compliance, data protection, privacy rights, and something that's really important here that Marion raised and probably Kylie too in terms of enforceable boundaries. Is there assurances or safeguards that mean that that data is being kept in one place? There's no mission creep or leakage that we can prevent. And of course, acceptability. So we need to think, is it trustworthy? Are the public going to accept this? And that brings in ethical considerations, but also what is the oversight regime? How accountable and transparent is this? And questions around cost effectiveness, because there's no point asking the public to go along with something that's going to cost millions of pounds if it doesn't actually work. So this matrix is just something, as I say, that I've applied to other technologies over the years. And of course, these things all overlap. And we can see that if you look at just the DNA database. So in terms of effectiveness, one of the difficulties is with the database is it's really difficult to discern how effective it is. And combined with that is there's a real misunderstanding in the public in just how effective it is. So there's a belief that it solves all these crimes, when in reality, it solves very few, like proportionally very few crimes. And my colleague Erin Amankwa has done a lot of work on how effective the DNA database is, how difficult it is to actually assess this, and also how public acceptability, how the public feel about having these mass DNA databases, but also the confusion around this effectiveness. And of course, the DNA database has been hugely controversial over the years. Years ago, we had lots of problems over inclusion of the DNA database, you know, discrimination and so forth, and who was covered. And of course, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics in 2007 were prompted to do a review of the use of forensic bioinformation. So they looked at personal protection of ethical values versus this kind of public interest in preventing and detecting crimes. But of course, they concluded there has to be a balance between personal liberty and the common good. And we should all know, of course, that in 2008, our national DNA database was ruled by the European Court of Human Rights to breach the European Convention. And of course, the tests that they apply there, the legal tests then, are about proportionality and necessity. In the National DNA Database's case, they said it was disproportionate, there was a blanket and indiscriminate collection of data and the retaining that data. And one interesting thing that I picked out the ruling there when we're thinking about this tracing app is that the mere retention and storing of personal data by public authorities, however they're obtaining it, has a direct impact on the privacy interests of that individual concerned, irrespective of the subsequent use made of that data. And that's very interesting. If people are saying, don't worry, you can put your data on this app, but we won't be using it, and so forth. So that's very interesting. So proportionality and necessity are two of the legal principles applied, and that has been reaffirmed just recently this year with the Goffin case, where they've still said that despite the amendments to our laws in respect of the National DNA Database, it is still failing to strike a fair balance between public and private interests. And one of the things they focused on was the lack of safeguards, the lack of review. So obviously the DNA database is not the only controversial technology that I've looked at. We obviously now have issues around automated facial recognition. And I think it's very interesting that that a few things come up here again in terms of effectiveness and whether the public will actually support things that are seen as being ineffective. I think that's a debate that's still ongoing, as is the debate around artificial intelligence and the impact of artificial intelligence and surveillance. These are very hot topics at the moment. So there have been questions raised around both facial recognition and AI, which I think are very pertinent and can be applied to this tracking app. So we have questions around facial recognition in terms of we need to discuss whether we have it before we discuss how we have it. What is it for? Do we need it? Who benefits from it? And do those benefits outweigh the harms? The Law Society, in a review of automated facial recognition, was concerned about normalising pervasive surveillance practices, which I think is a very pertinent point when it comes to this tracking app, with the idea that all of us are meant to download this app that will keep us under surveillance. And of course, there's been lots of warnings around how we need to approach AI and of course other technology, an approach that's centered around the human, where our protection of our fundamental rights is central. And the AI experts in the EU said recently, individuals should not be subjected to unjustified identification, profiling and nudging. And of course, the question then is whether or not this tracking app is justified then. So just then to finish up then, just to come back then, I hope that we can see there are lots of questions. We need to be able to answer all these questions in order to have a look at and see whether or not this tracking app has what I call integrity then. And these things are all closely bound up with one another, but they're all questions that need to be answered, and you can't omit to answer some of them and think that if you can just prove that something's effective, that's fine, it will be acceptable and legitimate at the same time. So just a couple of references there if anyone wanted to do any further reading. And I hope I've just done a whistle-stop tour there, Jonathan, of a few things that we can think about.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you. It was very useful, and it is a whistle-stop. These are highly complex matters, as will become clear during our questions now. Right, we've had quite a number of questions, so let me try to group them. I think one set of questions comes from two people. One is Lord Arbuthnot, a politician who worked a great deal of time in defense. The other one, similar to that, is from Sameh Youssef. Both are asking about the Bluetooth technology from two perspectives. One is suggesting that perhaps it's a weakness that the Bluetooth technology would be switched off on handsets and only switched on when the owner of the handset believes he or she are in an exposed or public position. And could that be a weakness? And the other suggestion may be that the Bluetooth should be on all the time, in which case the weakness may be more of security, of others piggybacking on our handsets for nefarious reasons or fraud. It's a tricky subject which involves both the technology and a question of judgment. Carly, would you like to answer any of these?
Yeah, sure. So this relates somewhat to the choice of protocol that the NHS have decided to pursue with their app, which is that because they're designing a bespoke system with a centralized protocol, it does mean that the app doesn't, there's a kind of ill-fitting to the extent that I understand from information in the public domain, between the app itself and devices that general people have. So one concern that has been aired through the Isle of Wight trial is that because you do have to leave your Bluetooth on and the app has to be in the foreground of your phone, that may lead to draining batteries because the app requires that type of battery power. Now, the reason this relates to the choice of protocol is there is an alternative way that the NHS could have gone and could still go, which is to use a particular API that has been developed by Google and Apple that would allow for a better fit between the app itself and the phones, the devices, and minimize some of these concerns around battery drainage, for example, that comes with Bluetooth. There has been some reporting in the last day or so in the Financial Times that they are considering switching to that protocol, and that would have flow-on effects for how the data is stored. So at the centralized protocol, the data is stored centrally with the NHS. If they move to a Google Apple API, then the data would be stored in an anonymized form on an individual's mobile phone, not requiring any central storage of data. That's a kind of evolving, bit of a movable feast. But you're right that the Bluetooth does need to stay on all the time. In Singapore, that has led to kind of less uptake than otherwise, both because of the battery drainage problem, but also because of the concerns people have about leaving their Bluetooth on. And then I'd just like to say, just quick last point on Bluetooth, of course, there are other concerns around, for example, could Bluetooth detect another phone through a wall, a thin enough wall, for example, might lead to a Bluetooth to register a contact when, of course, you haven't been in the same room. And then at the other end of the spectrum, of course, if you go into a room, you put your things down on the table and you touch the table, and then you later leave and someone comes along, and we know coronavirus can exist on an object, of course, the Bluetooth wouldn't pick up that type of contact. So those are just some of the kind of technical limitations.
Marion, would you have anything to add to this?
Just really to add that all those technical limitations and issues that Carly's mentioned really go to the point that Carol was making around, do these work? Does this tool work in a wider sense? I mean, what is the tool trying to achieve in terms of its purpose? And I think all those technical limitations have really got to be taken into account when we assess the purpose, and therefore whether this app is going to achieve this greater public health purpose that we're aiming for.
Marion, since I have you on, let me move to the next batch of questions. And I have two questions. One is from Mr. Richard Pinch, who's asking, what does trust actually mean in all of this? We keep on talking about trust. Well, what does it actually mean? And he elaborates and he says, well, we seem to be very happy to leak an enormous amount of private information about us to corporations like your supermarkets, like your frequent flyer programs, which they all seem to collect a huge amount of information about us, but we somehow seem to be so reluctant about our own entrusting government, our own government, with that information. And another question related to that is from Ardi, my colleague here at the Institute, who's asking if the government's reputation is one of the hindrances in trust, because the government does not enjoy a great reputation. Could one consider that the NHS, which apparently has a much greater reputation with the public, would be able to promote this app in a way that would increase the uptake? Mariette?
That's a really good questions, and actually this is something that came up earlier in the week at the CogX AI conference about whether the concept of trust is actually tied up with individuals' views about the organization which is collecting the data. I do think that that is a big factor here in terms of trust being tied up with attitudes to the organization doing the collecting. And I did a bit of research a number of years ago around attitudes to the collection of personal data, comparing attitudes to central government collection, local authority collection, and NHS collection of personal data. And it was very significant that the NHS was the most trusted organisation out of those organisations, and that may be to do with the individual relationship that we have with our doctors, etc. So yeah, I mean, so I do think that there is more that can be done to emphasise the bodies that are going to be using this data, and it's interesting that the government has not yet been prepared to actually countenance putting some very clear red lines in terms of data sharing into primary legislation in the same way that has happened in Australia, and I think that could really help matters here.
Can I just jump in on that very quickly to agree with Marion, but also to make the point that trust is not only something that the NHS enjoys, but it's something that the NHS needs in order to do its job. And so it is also putting trust on the line when it asks people to do things like download and use an app. And if trust reduces in the NHS, people won't trust. You come to the NHS with their problems, and then we have a much greater public health problem even than the one we face now. So that's a kind of fine line, I think, that the NHS has to walk on this.
So you wouldn't say that it's an easy solution to say this is an NHS app rather than a government app, in the hope that this will give it a greater uptake, because it could be a slippery slope. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I think the point is that, so absolutely the best way to get people to download this app would be to get their GPs to call them or send them an email or a letter saying, please download the app, because that's our closest connection with the NHS. It's our probably, I mean, I'm kind of guessing here, but the part of the NHS that people trust the most is the people that they see face to face, and through that kind of localized encouragement, that's how we could imagine we could build up trust. But at the same time, if then following a GP's advice, they download an app and they get a range of incorrect notifications, they know they haven't passed anybody on the street within 2 meters, and yet they start to get notifications saying you need to now self-isolate, or they self-isolate, they order a test, they can't get a test result for 4 or 5 days, and all of these things will then erode their trust, their enjoyment of the app, and thus by extension potentially erode their trust of their GP and the system. So it's a very big risk for the NHS to take. And I think what both Carol and Marion have said is it's so important then that the process that leads to that is as robust as possible. And I think the other way, of course, as Marion just said, is to make it clear that the NHS is the only actor that has access to this data would be to legislate, to put that in primary legislation, which would say no other government department can access this data, and there has been reluctance to do that so far.
Carol?
I think the interesting thing to ask about trust, and it is an important question when they're asking about what does trust actually mean, because of course, when we're talking about trust in personal relationships, we talk very often about reciprocity, that I trust you and you trust me, and we build up a relationship. The problem with these things is that I don't have that intimate knowledge or relationship with the NHS or with the government. There is some kind of ask of me then to do this on a sort of altruistic basis and a very trusting basis without knowing people, in which case it makes it vital that trust has to be based upon these ideas of accountability. There has to be some accountability. There has to be some oversight. I have to be able to see that there's some transparency around the operation of it, how it works and so forth. So the idea is that all of these things are linked, that I'm not going to trust something if I deem it to be unaccountable, or I can't work out how it works or what's happening with it, or it's ineffective, or no one can say to me how effective it is. So they require all of these things for me to trust it. And it doesn't, I mean, I see that the NHS already starts from a position of greater trust in the government, but it still would require all these other elements in order for the public to find it acceptable, I think.
So since I have you, Carol, I wonder, and Carly mentioned that or raised the possibility, can one argue that since it is a question of saving lives, as one of our participants, Mr. Rafael Moreto, is suggesting in his question, since it's a matter of saving lives, could we not suggest primary legislation or the use of existing legislation in order to enforce compliance or usage of these apps? Do you think that is an approach that is worth considering?
In terms of enforcing it, legislation still has to, unfortunately for some people, adhere to human rights. And of course, that requires then it to be necessary in a democratic society for the state to have these powers. And these powers have to be proportionate still. So yes, there would be then a big side of the equation saying, well, we're saving lives, but then that's going to need to be evidenced. And very often the government have struggled to evidence those kind of claims about massive benefits and so forth. And of course, the European Court of Human Rights, as we've seen, will also take into consideration, if you can argue that it's necessary and it's proportionate, are there safeguards in place so that people's human rights are still being protected, even were the government to enforce this massive amount of data collection and surveillance. So you would still need to be able to answer that equation. Is it necessary? Is it proportionate? And that will raise again all these questions about effectiveness and safeguards and so forth. So yes, you could do it, but you've still got to answer all of these questions.
But arguably, this will all fall down to judicial review. So by that time, the applications would already have been on most of the people's telephone. So primary legislation could actually work, at least in the short term, in encouraging uptake, or at least mandating uptake.
I think that's unlikely, simply from a technical perspective. I mean, I agree with everything Carol just said, but even from a technical perspective, even if you forced an update to people's phones, which potentially you could do, you could force the app to be downloaded. There's no way that you could forcibly deploy the app on the phone without people voluntarily turning on their Bluetooth, or make them carry their phone with them when they leave the house, for example. It's simply impossible to enforce, I would argue, and putting more of a burden on overstretched police forces to enforce that type of restriction. I think doing it by consent is really the only efficacious way to do it, and that comes back to trust.
Can I just point out that, I mean, there was lots of arguments that the National DNA Database would be far better and less discriminatory if we put everybody on it. And of course, then we would catch all the criminals and solve all the crime. And I remember a very senior police officer saying to me, at what point am I going to have to start DNA testing grandmas? Then we're going to have problems. And so you can have as much primary legislation as you like, but you're going to have to make my mother go and buy a smartphone. So I don't know how still that's going to work.
Okay, I think we probably covered that one. Let me turn to Marion, perhaps, to start with, on a question that we have from Robert Fox from the Evening Standard, who was wondering, what does this sort of experience of other countries suggest to us? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about countries like Israel or Singapore who have deployed these apps, allegedly with great success, or perhaps not. There's also been a discussion, as you are aware, in Israel, where the Supreme Court ruled that the Israeli security services cannot use the data that is being collected by the apps. So we have a body already of experience from other countries. What does it tell us, Marion?
Well, I think there's useful technical experience that can be taken from other countries' situations to address some of the issues that Carly mentioned earlier. I mean, I think on the legal side, some of the way that other countries have tried to integrate the contact tracing apps with other purposes or other applications, and to make those a wider type of system, I think should send message to us over here about the need, as we mentioned before, to really anticipate those types of issues and deal with that in clear guidance around the use of the app, and potentially in legislation that would make it entirely clear how this app is going to be used, where the data is going to be going, and restrictions on its use. And think that we haven't yet got to a situation where we can be confident that employers, landlords, others in the private sector can start requiring individuals to download the app as a condition of, say, renting a flat or having other services. And that's something that the project that Lillian Edwards headed up, and also the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights particularly highlighted. So I think we need to anticipate some of these things happening and deal with them now.
And indeed, we've already had the warning sign from Israel, where the intelligence services found the app a juicy target for gleaning quite a lot of information about people's movements. Carly, do you want to take any of this about the experience?
Just to clarify on Israel, and I think I understand this correctly, they weren't using Bluetooth apps. They were acquiring GPS location data on people who had gone into hospital with COVID, and then they were doing location-based tracking and then identifying others, contacts from that. So that's kind of arguably a slightly different legal threshold, and you're right, that was found unconstitutional. In terms of, so that's one point I want to make, and the other was in terms of other countries' experiences. It's easy to equate countries that have had a more positive response to COVID and who use an app. It's easy to project causation there when there is none. So a country like Singapore, we are looking at saying, well, they had a more effective response to the crisis, but it's not the case that effective response can be attributed to their use of a contact tracing app. And that comes from the horse's mouth itself, which is the people designing and using the contact tracing app in Singapore have said it wasn't the app itself which was determinative in their response, but rather the manual contact tracing, the kind of test and trace infrastructure that was effective. Equally in Iceland, where about 15% of people downloaded the app, sorry, it may be higher than that actually, it may be about 40% of people downloaded the app. The head of the contact tracing strategy there came out and said the app itself wasn't determinative. in that successful response, but rather manual contact tracing. In Australia, they have had a pretty good response to downloading the app. Perhaps as many as 40% of Australians have downloaded the app. Don't quote me on that number. I think they've traced one case through the use of the app to date. So I don't think there's a strong evidence base. Now, of course, this is something that we're doing at pace on the fly, and we wouldn't really expect a strong evidence base from things that have happened during the pandemic. But suffice it to say, I don't think there's a strong evidence base in support of a conclusion that a digital app can be decisive in a pandemic response.
Carol, do you have anything to add on the subject of that, or is it, or do you agree with the other suggestions?
Yeah, no, I think it goes to my point about evidence-based and being able to demonstrate how effective things are, and that actually we need evidence of this rather than just being told, you know, this will work, and for us to trust that information, that has to be evidence, and however difficult that might be to gather on the fly or whatever, then it has to be done. It's an essential part of being able to demonstrate the integrity of a system.
Excellent. We have a question from Madeline Moon, an MP, who's asking that we always had difficulties in our country to get acceptance of identity cards. Could this become a sort of ersatz identity card? Should we think a bit wider about this? Which also connects to a question from Gareth King, who is asking, if this app was to offer more than just trying to trace people who may be infected with a nasty virus, if it was offering some more capabilities to it, would it be something that would increase the uptake and therefore sort of enhance people's lives in a different way? Carly, do you want to start with that?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's certainly where conversation is going. That is, what digital tools will be developed next to enable individuals to establish their health status, potentially their immunity status, vis-a-vis a range of actors, so their employers, airlines, restaurants, etc. So this idea of immunity passports we've heard come up in some domains, and I think Madeline's point is right. It seems likely that will siege very quickly with the question of digital identity. The Tony Blair Foundation, Tony Blair Institute, put out a report yesterday or the day before calling for a digital identity system with exactly this functionality. That is the ability to establish one's immunity status or establish that you've had a positive antibody test. The report we published in April, we deal with this idea of immunity certificates, and I think it's a separate webinar essentially, because there are so many questions it raises about discrimination, stigmatization, exclusion, the creation of a two-tiered society, immune, not immune, how it might affect people's ability to take public transport or move around if you have to have an immunity credential, etc. So I think that that's a whole kind of bucket of information. But the point about it offering something to individuals and if it were appended to the contact tracing app, I think that that's an interesting point. I suspect that may be where we end up. That this is such a kind of movable feast, as I said, and I think maybe the NHS will end up in a different place than when it started.
Marion, do you want to say anything on this?
Just to add that I think if things started going in that direction, we would need to do as Carol did earlier in her slides and think about what we can learn from other contexts here in terms of the sort of mass collection of data by the state, and in previous other contexts such as the use of bulk data sets by the intelligence services. We've found the need to legislate for that and to have an independent oversight regime associated with it, and I think that would need to be very much on the table.
And Carol, I mean, we have Caroline Limbrick reminding us that the NHS itself is not exactly great about protecting its databases. I mean, it had quite a number of breaches. So, I mean, from your experience of looking at other databases that are clinically relevant, do you think we can consider expanding the future? In the future, could we expand the use of such apps?
I think your big difficulty is those equations then still about whether it's proportionate. So the amount of data you're going to demand from me, you're going to have to be able to demonstrate, of course, that you need that data and that it's proportionate to, you know, what the benefits are going to be. The big problem with the ID cards was that they were wildly disproportionate, and the government could not prove that they were necessary. Because we couldn't articulate the benefits that were going to be derived from us giving all this data to the government, and yet there were massive risks involved. And so, yeah, the NHS, the people might trust it because they have to go to the NHS and speak to a doctor, and they have that personal experience with it. That's very different to whether I trust it to hold all of my personal information for different purposes, and the idea that they've got the security and the technology to be able to protect that data, and the safeguards are there, that there wouldn't be any kind of mission creep, which is a particular risk. If you look back at developments with bioinformation in the criminal justice system, of course, we started with fingerprints, and then because we trusted fingerprints and the police had this database, then it was assumed, and that's why they were called DNA fingerprints originally, to piggyback on the trust that we had already. And so then it expands to DNA, and the assumption is that that's okay. And then it's expanded to shoe prints, and then it gets expanded to photographs. And then, of course, we get facial recognition from it. So you can see all these steps. Just because you said at the beginning, oh, don't worry, it's the NHS, and we're only going to get this data, and this is the only way we're going to use it. There have to be measures and safeguards in place so that we don't incrementally then build upon this, and then before we know it, we're in a situation where the DNA database, for example, went way out of control, and then we had to scale it back again.
I think we will have to stop here, sadly. I'm sorry, and I apologize to scores of people who have not managed to put their question. We did our best to batch them up as much as we could. All that remains for me now is to thank the three participants, Marion Oswald, Carly Kind, and Carol McCartney, for their wonderful presentations. I think just as a reminder to us of how complicated the issue is, it will provide us with some knowledge as we see the systems rolling across the nation, or at least across England in a particular fashion, over the next few weeks. Thank you all. Thank you to the participants for attending our webinar, and keep watching us